Welcome to the Unsung podcast. I just blew out Chris's ears in the edit there, because that is a big fucking peak I can see in my waveform. Welcome to the Unsung podcast, as I said, where we talk about albums that we like, that other people are maybe unfamiliar with. That's about the gist of it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, overdriven, saturated vocals are the name of the game today anyway, so that's fine.
Yeah, they are. So, welcome. We have a guest with us this week because Dave couldn't make it. It's Vicki.
Hiya.
Dave's in hell and about to spend his weekend on a park bench. Apparently he's having problems moving into his new house.
Oh dear.
So our thoughts and prayers.
I hope I'm a fitting substitute.
So Vicki, what brings you to this fine podcast then?
I am going to be talking about an album that I really like today. I feel like I'm standing in front of like a primary school class.
How would you do it if you were standing in front of a primary class? Vicky's a teacher, so this is perfect. So.
As a teacher?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about you do this in the style of like teaching?
I can't do that, I'm afraid. Sorry, it's a completely different personality. It would just feel weird.
You get like red light fever when you're in the classroom as well.
What's that? I feel like in the last 20 seconds I've been like put on a hot seat with like a camera and a light shone in my face, and I was telling Mark about like 10 seconds before we come on here that I'm suffering from major social anxiety, so do you want to like turn it down a notch, please?
Okay. Well, I saw from the look in your face that you took red light fever to mean all the worst things it could possibly mean. It doesn't mean you're addicted to prostitutes. Anytime somebody hits record, you clam up and get really nervous. You know, it's like you're fine until the red light for record goes on, and then suddenly your brain goes blank. That's red light fever.
That's what I've got. Among other things, obviously.
Have you ever told the student to fuck off?
Have I ever told?
Yeah.
I most certainly have not, no.
She's not going to say it on here, is she? Damn it. I'm going to incriminate herself. Jeez, oh man.
No, it's no, nothing like that's happened at all.
But as you can tell, Mark likes nothing better than trying to throw our friends and allies under a bus. If there's a scoop on the podcast, nobody is indispensable. And with that in mind, Vicki, you have chosen a close friend of the podcast for this week's episode, and we are promptly going to spend an hour or so throwing them under a bus.
Yep, I know.
Especially with a nexus that goes to Varg Vikernes.
Oh Christ, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do you want to fill us in on what we're looking at? Yep,
today I have chosen to talk about Blanck Mass, Dumb Flesh.
For anyone that's been following the podcast for a while, you'll know that we did a sort of in-depth interview with Ben, aka Blanck Mass. How many episodes ago was that, Mark? 100?
Yeah. It was a wee while ago.
Yeah.
2000. It was the first episode came out on May the 3rd, 2019, so almost 2 years ago.
Yeah. So Mark wasn't there for that interview. It was David and myself went through to Ben's house. Mm-hmm. But I would strongly recommend, especially if you enjoy this episode, I would strongly recommend going back and listening to it. It was a really good interview. We covered Ben's own work. He's also a founder member of the band Fuck Buttons. Yeah, then he nominated some really interesting stuff for the third part of that show. So go back and check that out. I can't remember the episode number. I don't know, maybe like 70 or 74 or something in around there. And I'll be drawing on some things from that interview. Now, for the sake of brevity, we're not going to talk too much about Fuck Buttons, which is a huge part of Ben's musical legacy. And informs Blanck Mass quite a bit as well. So we're going to leave that. If you'd like to know more about Fuck Buttons and do a wee bit of dive in them, again, go back and listen to the interview. Mm-hmm. But Blanck Mass is him, solo. Vicki, when did you first hear it?
So I think I heard about Blanck Mass, obviously. You had put him on, I think, maybe at Restless Natives, is that right?
Yep,
and I meant to go to that, but I never really took any.
It's the story of, can I just say, that's the story of all the shows I put on. Mark, how many times have you heard that? Oh, I meant to go to your show.
Don't you dare.
So many times.
Been very supportive. I think that, not that I was put off, but I didn't think I would like it. For some reason, I think I am at that stage in my life. The older I get, like, the less willing I am to make an effort about things. And Chris, you know that about me as well. Like, it's painful. It's painful at times, right?
Because I remember 20 years ago, you were so different.
I am a bit of a, I kind of get set in my ways about things. But was looking just at the name Blanck Mass, I thought, and like the font and everything, I was like, that's going to be some like metal thing that I don't like. And I didn't. I don't even think I made the connection with fuck buttons. I did really like fuck buttons as well, but not like, I wasn't like massively into them or anything. But what happened was, I think you invited me to that exhibition at the Queen's Church in Maryhill. It had the moon at it. Remember, there was that big exhibition with the moon. Yeah. And it was like May time. It was lovely, and I went along to that. Primarily went to see that big moon thing, but that was the reason I was going to the gig.
Yeah, he was performing,
and he was performing at it. And so, like, I never really. I thought, I'll just go. It'll be fun, and do you know what I mean? But oh my god, it blew me away completely, that gig. It was such a performance, and so I think at that time it might have been World Eater that he was mostly playing stuff from. It was really, really loud, and it felt, I know, like, we'll talk later about World Eater and this other stuff. It's very carnival-y, and when I was there, I felt like I was on a ride. Do you know what I mean? I felt like I was like on that sticky wall. Like now when you're on a sticky wall and you're like stuck to the back of a sticky wall, like, because there's all this pressure. That's what it felt like. It was like an assault. Assault sounds bad. It wasn't an assault. It was more pleasurable than that. But it was full on sound. I don't know. Right? And
I think assault's quite accurate, honestly, because I mean that's a big part of his shtick. I mean, it's electronic music, but it's delivered in a metal fashion. I mean, you're talking about the font. We'll touch on that quite a bit. But he very much courts the imagery and I think the sonics of extreme metal. I mean, he's a big fan of that personally. And
it was incredible. And I think, like, at one point I turned around, because it was sitting down, because we were all sitting in pews because it's a church, right? I turned around to just like look around me and like got a glimpse at the audience sitting watching this, and that's like a kind of picture I've got like stuck in my head, is all these kind of, it was mostly young guys, to be honest, faces watching this, like their mouths hanging open, like totally.
Can I use the Scottish word agog?
Agog, absolutely agog. It was so good. After that minute, I was like, this is my thing. I love this.
Mark, were you at that show?
That was the first time I'd ever seen him. A girl that I was talking to at the time wanted to go, and I arranged a date with her, and she told me she liked Blanck Mass.
But I think we saw you at that show.
Yeah, you would have done.
I vaguely remember that. Aye.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we tried to give him his space because he was working his magic.
Aye.
And it was visceral. I remember feeling the bass in my chest and being like, I'm sitting in a fucking church in a pew getting punched in the chest. Like the sound system in here is like literally unholy. Like this would not fly anywhere else, you know. Mm-hmm. And it was something else, man. It actually totally blew me away as well.
That was a great show, and I think, as you say, it really communicated the confrontational nature of Blanck Mass's electronic music, because I mean, obviously electronic music runs a gamut, and you know, when we interviewed Ben, we spoke about people like John Hopkins. And trying to sort of diplomatically make the point that I like John Hopkins, but I think it's very safe. It's very gentle, you know, and there's a riskiness to Blanck Mass's take on electronic music that I think very few people are brave enough to attempt. I mean, the fact that he pulls it off is even more admirable, but electronic can be very, very safe these days, whereas even Ben's mixes are brutal. Like really brutal in places. His more recent stuff is incredibly intense. It's as heavy as most metal albums you'll hear at points. as well as occasionally dropping into kind of unconventional R&B and things like that as well. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting choice, and it's the point at which his career under that moniker took off. We'll take a wee cycle through his backstory just now, I think, to set that scene. I mean, Ben's from Worcester, England, originally Benjamin John Power, depending on where you're looking up. He kind of made a name for himself in Bristol around about 2004 when he started Fuck Buttons with the other founder of Fuck Buttons, Andrew Hung. He's a guy that's moved around a bit. He spent a fair bit of time in London around the peak of Fuck Buttons when the whole ATP scene was really big as well, and he's now actually living in Edinburgh. I think a lot of people are surprised to know that he's a Scottish based artist now, but very much so, like quite integrated into the musical community up here, close with the people from like Rock Action, Mogwai, and his bands have crossed paths quite a few times. The Fuck Buttons album Taro Sport, which was a big album for them, it's their second full album. It came out in about 2009. After that, he'd started working on his own material more. I believe, referring back to that interview we did, Ben was saying that Fuck Buttons had been touring really heavily. They were doing really well. They were on the up. They had this. I think it was Andrew Weatherall who produced that album, and they toured with Mogwai. They toured with Pixies, which was a really intense tour with big crowds, and they badly needed a break. And this was a period where they took a little respite to try and recover as human beings. And Ben, spent some time working on this solo stuff. He released that debut album, which is a self-titled album on Rock Action Records, kind of thanks to the Mogwai connection, because Fuck Buttons and Mogwai had collaborated on some stuff, remixed each other's work, played together a lot. I saw Fuck Buttons opening for Mogwai actually at a big show in Glasgow. Now that first album is a very, very ambient album, and when you listen to it, it seems to have a minimal amount in common with where he is now. Or maybe more accurately, where he was around about the Animated Violence Mild album. He's brought out an album this year which is quite different, and we'll mention that. And it's maybe a little bit more consistent with the very, very early stuff in its ambient experimental nature. But did you guys listen to the first record?
I just briefly. It was okay. I couldn't really get into it, to be honest. Along with my diminishing desire to make much effort is my attention span, and I just wasn't really for me.
It's kind of ambient and formless. You can see it's like it's completely different to what he was doing at the time. And I guess if you're looking for a release after you've been in a really intense place for a number of years, and it, like in context, this record totally makes sense, right? It is a different form of release. It is very formless. It's tuneful in places. Sundowner was used quite a lot in the 2012 Olympics, wasn't it?
That's a huge pivotal point, both in his personal life and in his professional life. Yeah.
That's a good song.
Sundowner is a nice song. Danny Boyle curated that opening ceremony for the 2012 Olympics in London, and he chose it. It was played by the London Symphony Orchestra when I think the British team were coming out. And at various flag points, and it kept popping up during the show, and obviously that in a practical level led to a lot of royalties for Ben, and that revenue, apart from enabling him to do things like put a down payment down on a house and things that we spoke about in the interview, actually gave him a mixture of a little bit of autonomy with this project and a little bit of like belief in it as a project. I mean, I think he was enjoying what he was doing, but Blanck Mass suddenly had like a real injection of profile. He's been in this marriage that was Fuck Buttons, this duo for a long time, and this maybe gives you that little bit of courage to sort of take your side project, inverted commas, seriously, you know. And I think very much Blanck Mass has long since transitioned from a side project into his main project. Clearly, I mean, Fuck Buttons, it's very unlikely to release anything else. But yeah, you're right. This is a very, very ambient album. It's slow. It's hard to get into, and it's kind of what it is. I think it was given voice to something, as you say, maybe the need to speak softly musically after all these years of like pummeling out these big saturated long songs. Like, it was a chance for him to do, you know, it's like Kerry King doing an acoustic album or something like that. You know, it's a chance to just chill out for a bit and do something that's quite mellow and nice and explore these other parts of his electronic tendencies. Because I mean, Ben came from bands as well. Ben was there's some hilarious photos of him in his first new metal band when he was a kid, so I don't know if he'd ever really had the chance to fully explore what he would do in electronic music outside of Fuck Buttons, and so he was really discovering stuff at this point as well. There's some other really nice tracks in it. I mean, as good as Sundowner is, I don't think it's the best track on it. I really like a track on it called Chernobyl. Which is, I mean, we laughed about it in the interview, or rather I got laughed at in the interview for saying it's got hints of Moby, but I mean hints of Moby at his best, not at his like most commercial, but at his kind of softest and sweetest. It's quite dreamy, and I do really like that. It also calls back to a band called Stars of the Lid. And Stars of the Lid is one of the bands that Ben nominated on that show, and they're tremendous. Beautiful, ambient, expansive, slow, mood-based works, but yet really quite complex and rich. Really, really worth checking out. There's an album called The Tired Sounds in particular, if you're curious about them. I also think it's worth noting the tune on that first album called What You Know. Which until this year I think was the longest thing he'd ever released at about 13 minutes as an individual standalone track. It's just got this really saturated drama to it. There's some really dynamic chord changes in it, which are really a feature of Blanck Mass. I mean, they're a feature of Fuck Buttons to some extent as well, but they're definitely a feature of Blanck Mass. Those were the first times you heard those really dynamic changes appear, and I think that they're fantastic. They really foreshadow a lot of what he's doing now. There's about 5 minutes of sort of disintegrating arps at the end of that song, which is something that crops up a bit on Dumb Flesh as well. And it's also that last bit, the arpeggiated bit, it's probably the first appearance of any real rhythm in Blanck Mass music. And this was the only album, as you mentioned, very ambient, very dreamlike. It doesn't have any percussion on it, but the arps have a form of percussion to them, and percussion makes an appearance in a big way on the album that follows. Between this album and the next full album, he released a couple of individual things. There was a White Math EP. Like a 12-inch, I believe. And when we interviewed Ben, he was saying that's very percussive, and he was specifically trying to write a sort of clubby track. He was trying to challenge himself and see what would come out of him if he tried to write for a dance floor. And it's not massively overcooked in terms of production. You know, I think it's quite lean in production, but there's a lot of melody in there, and it's a huge stylistic shift. But it's the first of a number of huge stylistic shifts that he makes, because I think this is something that we really have to mention early on. Whereas Fuck Buttons in particular, and I mean a lot of other electronic projects, seem to transition quite slowly from record to record, and even though they maybe end up in a very different place after a while, you can sort of see that progression in gradations, whereas Blanck Mass really jumps about sometimes. You know, he's got anarcho punk, like industrial anarcho punk on one record. He's got an ambient record. He's got that stripped back clubby sort of light techno record. Then he's got this full on saturated, almost like R&B power pop that appears in World Eater and Animated Violence Mild records. It's quite jumpy. Like you can tell he's quite restless creatively, and doesn't really mind giving you whiplash. I mean, I guess that's consistent with the volume and the approach of the music anyway. The White Noise EP was followed by it was kind of really just a long single called Hell on Earth in 2012. That was actually mastered by Hicks and Cloak, I believe.
Really?
Yeah, they had a pretty close relationship at that point. It's a single. It's got a busier arrangement, and you start to see the sort of more complex layered structures of Blanck Mass as we kind of know it now appearing. Now, in 2014, after that, Fuck Buttons actually released their final album to date, but I would wager final album called Slow Focus, which for me I think is their best album. It's Ben's favourite of their records as well. It features a couple of tracks in particular, Red Wing and Stalker, that I think are outstanding. It's much doomier overall. It's really quite an oppressive album, and you can tell that the music tonally is getting darker, more malevolent, there's a kind of sinister thing emerging. And as you said, Vicky, about the fonts and stuff, you know, from the early Blanck Mass stuff and then the White Math polymorph, he kind of really starts to court darker imagery in his work. You know, by the time you get to Dumb Flesh, it's quite sort of like, I don't mean troubling artwork, but the artwork's not. It's not meant to be easy in the eye and
disconcerting.
You know, yeah, and the mystique around it becomes quite a sort of slightly occult, you know, and I think that's been carried on right up until Inferno, his most recent one. But yeah, that Fuck Buttons release in 2014 was followed by the first fully percussive, fully arranged, shall we say, Blanck Mass release of Dumb Flesh, the record you've picked in 2015. We'll come back to Dumb Flesh, of course, but he followed that quite a significant EP, I think, creatively speaking, The Great Confuso. It's three pieces that, as I was saying about him jumping stylistically, I mean, even just in the context of that EP, the three pieces jump stylistically on purpose. The first one is very kind of electro dancey. It's quite similar to White Math, albeit a little bit more full in its production. The second one is this like ferocious anarcho screamo punk thing. Mid-80s industrial punk stuff. It's quite odd and very full on, and it sets the scene for an EP. We bring it later, and the third track on it is ambient again, and it calls way back to that first album we spoke about. This record significantly does have a lot of use of chopped and sequenced vocal parts, which is a big motif for Blanck Mass records. You know, whilst he does do some vocals, he doesn't do clean vocals really, and taking and ripping apart and then reconstructing, pitch shifting, speed shifting, time stretching these vocal sections from other people's works. Great Confuso, followed by a single for Adult Swim, D7, D5. Which was a big step in terms of production. It's a really thick, densely produced track that I think feels closest to some of the more recent stuff. Has a dark techno vibe to it. It's quite sophisticated in the tone choices as well. You can tell that he's getting more confident and more into the technology that he's using. I think we asked him in the the interview as well. Fuck buttons, they got their name from the fact that they used to use fucked up old toys that had been like circuit bent. You know, it was the ultimate lo-fi approach to making weird electronic music. They were running kids' toys through distortion pedals, and it was really chaotic. I remember Ben talking about running about a room with a bit of a washing machine in his head, banging it to create a sample and stuff, you know. So they had a very, very low-tech approach to that project. So I think around about the time they brought out D7, D5, he's now engaging with some really high-end bits of equipment. He's still running them through pretty much every Metal Zone pedal in the world. So he's taking high-end equipment and running it through, for want of a better phrase, lower tech. And it's an interesting juxtaposition, I think. It gives it a lot of its character. But certainly the more basic approach seems long gone, as do a lot of the positive chords, the posy vibes, the major chords. Almost everything now is played in like minor keys, quite dark. It always has a vague undercurrent of malevolence. World Eater 2017 was the next thing he released, and I know that you guys have some opinions on this.
Yeah, I love it. In fact, I think I've said to both of you, like, I picked Dumb Flesh almost kind of instinctively. Personally, I feel really connected to it from whenever I started listening to it and what was happening in my life at the time. But World Eater is just incredible as well, and I kind of thought, oh, maybe I should have picked that instead. But I think it's maybe more of a complete album than Dumb Flesh, and I know we'll speak about Dumb Flesh later, but thematically it's more linked together. It's just got some absolute belters on it, like, you know, Rhesus Negative. That is incredible. I was listening to that. I've listened to that so much this week, and every time I listen to it, I hear something else. And like, you know, you say he jumps about with like style and things like that. Like, I was listening to it the other day, and I'm like, I can hear like a almost kind of Ennio Morricone, Once Upon a Time in the West harmonica in the background at one point. It's fantastic.
Yeah, you know, I think Rhesus Negative in particular is interesting. It's got a lot of movements in it, like movements in the sense of like
stages.
Multi-movement. Yeah. Loads of layers of stuff. I mean, I think at this point he's gone for a really maximalist approach to the production. This is why it's quite different from the likes of White Math Polymorph. Like, he's really saturating the sound now. Even at the quieter bits, there's almost always multiple things happening in different ears, things happening in the background, and subconsciously it sometimes contributes to the sinister feeling, because you don't know what it is that's creepy about it until you really sit and concentrate and pull it apart sonically as you're listening to it. He uses a lot of the dynamic chord changes that I was talking about from the very end of that debut album. There's the black metal vocals have become a really big thing in the project by now. You know, he's using really saturated, overdriven but buried vocals to really, I think, compound that metal edge. You know, the connotations of like heavy metal, extreme metal. It's quite a grandiose song in places. You know, it's almost got a kind of space battles kind of thing happening at times. And what I think's most interesting about this song is, given that Dumb Flesh was a bit of a breakthrough album for him, you know, given that it did land very, very well critically, and there were definitely signs of like, okay, this guy's going to be a force to be reckoned with production wise, you know, because he was breaking through around about the time as Wonotrix and Hacks and Cloak and these other producers, and there was a sort of sense of like this sort of young cartel of edgy electronic guys appearing. It's really not safe, and that's one of the things I admire the most about it, is that he comes straight out the gates on that album with one of the least safe tunes you could possibly have done. You know, you've just made this album that had all these techno and electro hints in it, and you could have come back with something that was quite sort of aiming for a wee bit of radio play, aiming for a wee bit of commerciality. And there are moments on this album that do that. I'll talk about one in a second, but I think Rhesus Negative is a great opening statement. I'm not really interested in watering anything down. I think it's worth mentioning though the brilliance of the track that comes after it, Please. I think Please was one of the tracks of the year. It drops straight out of Reese's Negative, which is significant. You know, it's like Wile E. Coyote running off a cliff. You know, it's just suddenly you look down and all that saturation is gone, all that noise floor is gone. It's just this beautiful, calm bit of music. That's a huge song for Blanck Mass. Career-wise, it showed that he wasn't going to just do industrial noise. It showed that he wasn't going to just do dance floor techno. It's got a trappy R&B element to it.
Yeah.
And it shows he's a really rounded songwriter, I think, and it has like pop aspirations on his own terms. I think it really blew open. We've spoken about this all the way back to the start of this podcast. Sometimes artists do things that blow open the doors of possibilities for the rest of their career. You know, it's a bit like Radiohead. You know, you take a chance early on, but then it gives you so much more scope later on because it doesn't jar, because you've already set your parameters so wide. In terms of the track itself, it's got that really nice crunchy percussion in it. You know, he could have done it sweet, but he doesn't. He keeps it nice and distorted. It's got a really gospel vibe to the vocal that I think's not an accident. There's a beautiful, warm, sort of sweet steel drum melody in it that reminds me a wee bit of some of the Knife's work, which I'm a big fan of, obviously. And I think that track was actually, I remember I'm talking about this in the interview, that the track was actually dictated by the vocal chops. And I think that's a really interesting thing about it. It was actually led by where those vocals were ending up. It's also, without a doubt, one of his biggest click moments live. I mean, Ben said that himself. You always know you've got the crowd on side.
Yeah, I think it's a really good album. I really enjoyed it. I also particularly like The Rat. I think that's a really good song.
The Rat, again, really thumping dark 80s industrial techno. It actually feels like Godflesh for the first couple of minutes in that tune, albeit a wee bit more arranged than your typical Godflesh song. I think Silent Treatment's worth mentioning as well. That big fanfare at the start, but then it like a bit like Please drops into this beautiful sort of like much sexier, more vibey R&B type thing.
Aye, and the vocal samples are used kind of percussively as well.
I think that's one of the keys to the vocals as well. I mean, they're not just percussive and they're not just melodic.
No.
They really do two jobs, and that's a bit of masterstrokes. It makes them all the hookier.
The fact that they're cut up and a bit screwed up and stuff as well, really, I'll talk about this in Dumb Flesh, but it really adds to malevolence of it as well. You can hear something, but you actually can't, and it's
sci-fi or something, you know. It's rather than like truly gothic or horrific or something like that. It's like an unsettling darkness.
Can I put my finger on it? It's the sonic version of the Uncanny Valley.
I was going to say that, the Uncanny Valley.
It's exactly that, because it's a human voice, but it's also imperceptible in a weird way.
Aye.
So you're getting that weird dissonance that's unsettling. He followed this with a really, really interesting move. He brought out an EP called Odd Scene Shit Luck. It was kind of a split single in 2018, which is just 2 tracks of ferocious anarcho-punk. It's got elements of Atari Teenage Riot, black metal, a bunch of old school crust, and then industrial noise. It's really furious. Lots of his vocals, his overdriven kind of black metal vocals done through, I think it was a CV radio. I mean, it's miles away from both like the self-titled album and the Polymorph record.
I love that single, man. That Odd Scene was a total highlight live.
Yeah, of the 2, Odd Scene's a bit more typically Blanck Mass, albeit it's got, I think, his first ever solo in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's slightly longer and fuller. I personally actually prefer Shit Luck. I love that.
I think they're both awesome, man.
Shit Luck has just an amazing chord progression in the middle 8. That pushes it right over the top. Like, I think it's brilliant, but very unsettling. And I'm sure there were a lot of people who were, certainly people that had heard Please, which was another song that made a bit of an impact for him. You know, going from Please, which is that's, like I said, trappy and pretty soulful, into this like furious anarcho-punk. It's a bold move. And again, followed that with another, I would say, very strong but very full-on album in 2019, Animated Violence Mild. That feels very consistent with World Eater. I think they both have a strong through line of identity, much more so than the earlier work. Ben's talked about how since Dumbflesh onwards, his albums have always felt a bit like mixtape projects. I do think that Animated Violence Mild and World Eater sound more album-like. Yeah. What about this record? Any standout tracks for you?
It's my favourite one. I like how it's big 80s sounding. It's almost cheesy, but not quite. I read some interviews anyway saying that was kind of deliberate, but it's to kind of show how consumerism blossomed in the 80s. But he's talked before about how he loves 80s music as well, right? So we know that's a thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, Hush Money, that fourth track sounds like a mixture of like Heart and Roxette.
Oh yeah, it's amazing, that song.
But covered by Nine Inch Nails or something like that. It's got a real like mid to late 80s romance about it.
I remember you heard the album, Chris, and then you said to me, that his new album's fucking great, like you're really going to like it. And then when it came out, I listened to House vs House and I was like, holy shit, like there's so much more melody in it. You know, he's always got melodies kicking around and there's a lot of them in his music, but they're always kind of bubbling away on the edges, but kind of brought more to the forefront in this album, I think.
It's interesting you mentioned House vs House, because I think it's easily one of his best bits of work, full stop. I think that track is just so fucking good. It's like one of his hookiest, without having a lead vocal, so to speak. The vocal chops are a bit more foregrounded in it. I mean, it's similar. It's like a kind of cousin to Please, but yeah, just a bit more realised in terms of like confidence. It's a lot more major as well. It's one of the first moments in a long time that he'd started throwing in some real positive vibes. Yeah, I think that's a tremendous song. I mean, we're kind of skipping right by Death Drop as well. I was going to
say that next. Yeah,
I think it does a similar job to Reese's Negative in the sense that it comes out the gates right. We're not fucking selling out. We're going to do something that's really hard for you to digest, and you're just going to have to fucking like it.
Yeah.
It's almost club ready though as well. It's almost like a club banger.
Dense as fuck.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting listening to you talking about the melodic parts of that album, because I did like have a few thoughts about that myself. I mean, you said Roxette and Heart or something, and that's interesting to me, because I think that I was thinking more along the lines of like Backstreet Boys or something like that. Mm-hmm. I thought it was very poppy melodies in places, and then see the happy hardcore stuff. It's bouncing about like a computer game. For me, I'm still trying to get my head around that album, to be honest with you. I know what you mean about there is a through line for World Eater from it, and I think that I'll need to just spend a bit more time with it, but it's so saturated, and I'm not sure. Like I said to you last week, I was like, Backstreet Boys doing happy hardcore. Only to just...
Does Ben not have a line of merchandise like mugs that say something like Blanck Mass is just Venga Boys for goths or something like that? I don't.
It has a bounciness to it that I can definitely pick up on that. Like, I think that even again the cover art for that as well is it's very colourful. The colours are dead saturated. And so is the sound.
Yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
I think another track just before we move on for that one, Love is a Parasite, is worth mentioning. It's got a real, like, you know, Fragile era Nine Inch Nails. It really reminded me of that sort of production, those dead drops that he does on the chords. But I think that the vocals in that song do some brilliant things.
Definitely.
And I think, I mentioned Nine Inch Nails twice there. I think this album overall, you were saying, Vicky, it is a bit more overtly retro. It is a bit more computer gamey and 80s and power ballad riffery, and there's probably a bit of Pretty Hate Machine in it as well, from that kind of late 90s industrial pop style stuff. It's denser, it's hard, but I think you should persevere with it. It's really good.
Yeah.
And he's followed that up with an album this year called Inferno, which is spelled in a kind of unusual way, but it's totally different again. 2 sort of 20-ish minute tracks. It was preceded by a single, which was, I think, a crop of a part of one of those tracks called Star Stuff. He's titled them Phase 1 and Phase 2. It's really a very experimental record. Phase 1 is a little bit more structured and electro. It's got a couple of catchier moments and some really nice arpeggiated stuff in it. I think 13 minutes onwards it goes into this really beautiful ambient passage.
Yeah.
That makes some really nice nods to Stars of the Lid, who I've mentioned, but also a group called La Bradford. It's packed with experimental electronic moments and a lot of field recordings.
Yeah, found sound for sure. A lot of found sound, man.
Ben's really big in his field recordings, and this is the record where he seems to have really brought a lot of them out. It's an extremely anti-commercial release, basically. 2 20-minute tunes, yet it seems to have been received really well critically, which is good, because there's a lot to engage with, and it's nice that the reviewers were willing to take the time to try and engage with it, because it's a daunting thing. Other than that, we should mention that he's done a lot of soundtrack work, or he's increasingly doing a lot of soundtrack work. He had done little forays into it. I mean, I think the first one he did was in 2013. He did A Field in England. That really odd sort of surreal English movie. He did Strange Colour of Your Body's Tears. I think he rescore that in 2015.
Him and 7 other artists, yeah.
Yeah, and then in 2019, or I think it was 2019, maybe released in 2020, he did the soundtrack to a film Calm with Horses. Which is sort of shot in Ireland. What's that guy, Cosmo
Jarvis.
Cosmo Jarvis, the star of it, who's also some musician.
Cracking Irish accent for an American as well.
Cracking film, actually. I really like that film. It's the kind of film my dad really likes as well. It's got that rough gypsy mobster thing to it.
It's sinister as fuck, man. I love it.
It is fucking dark as the night, absolutely. I think it's also interesting to see that Mark Kermode called Calm with Horses the best soundtrack of 2020. And I believe that it's also been announced that he's doing the soundtrack to Ted K, the Unabomber biopic.
Nice.
So that's us up to date on Blanck Mass, and that kind of brings us to Dumb Flesh, Vicky, going back to 2015.
I think I picked this album because it's maybe the first one that I listened to, and as you kind of know, your first introduction to something can be the most formative, or the one that hits deepest. And
yeah, you always get a bias, don't you?
Always, no matter what. And I think that maybe my favourite Blanck Mass songs are on this. So that the first one is Loam, and it's got a really weird vocal. Did you tell me that this was
Yeah, Vicky, we're not meant to fucking say that though. So I think I'll just bleep that.
Right.
We don't want to land him in court.
Okay.
Although there's people out there all over the internet that whenever there's a vocal sample they're not sure of, they strip the track back and put it up on YouTube. You can probably find some bored guy that's worked out what this is by just sitting deconstructing it.
If you've worked out what that is, then exactly.
It's like putting a pig back together for a box of bacon. Sorry, Ben's vegan. He wouldn't approve of that.
But do you know what? There's something so horrific about that it kind of matches that track, because it's so just like weird and creepy and kind of. I agree with you, but I will say, given that it's sort of a mood piece and a tonal piece, and it's designed to unsettle and really set a palette out as well. I think it's there to sort of say this is the scope of what I'm going to do. It's got no right to be as musical as it is, but I really like the music of that song. Like the way the vocal meshes with the underlying chords is surprisingly musical, and I think whether or not that was deliberate, I'm sure he'll say it was, but the fact that such a mood piece is also really musically rewarding as well, that's sold me on it. And then see the way Dead Format just starts. I love that as well. It's really great, and it's a kind of pace change from the first one as well. I went to Rome for the first time in 2018, and that was like when I started listening to Blanck Mass. It's when I went to that gig, and I just wondered about the Vatican City with Dead Format on, which I didn't realise the irony of that at the time. But I made this like Instagram video of me like walking up to the Vatican, and I had put Dead Format on it because that's what I'd been listening to, and I thought it's actually perfect for that, because it's like so kind of apocalyptic or something. Like it could be in a sci-fi action film like Mad Max or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's got that Thunderdome scale to it. I don't want to sabotage anything, but you could have used that for your Nexus, because it can be hard to tie Varg Vikernes to the Pope somehow. People who didn't know what Blanck Mass was going to flower into, they just heard this ambient album and a couple of standalone tunes. It has a huge impact. It's got a huge impact live, as Ben will say. It's along with Please, it's one of the absolute stick on, get the crowd on your side kind of tunes. I think it's quite militaristic. I think it's got that mixture of a gallop and a march that's quite unsettling, the way it relentlessly grinds on throughout without rushing, and I think the chopped vocal motif in that song really set the scene for where he was going to go with that as an approach. Yeah, I mean, talking about like Mad Max or whatever, it's got real John Carpenter vibes on it, on the lead synth for sure, man. I've written here it's like a rave at the end of the world, because it feels like it feels like it'd be a better song than the song they used in that second Matrix film when they're doing the big massive rave. And this would have been a better choice. I think Ben would have been sick in his mouth. But it's funnily enough, he's remixed John Carpenter, and I think it must have been tracks like this that influenced that. I mean, he's really effective at the way that he kind of shifts the landscape of this song just by adding and removing different melodies. One of my favourite things about this album, and he does it a lot, is like different melodies kind of come in and out on different synth parts, and they kind of frit around the edges of the mix, and they never really come into full focus. And when you get the kind of chopped up vocal effect going on at the same time, it kind of starts to feel like a simulacrum of like humanity. It feels a little bit like there's almost like a ghost in the machine. You don't quite get to see the ghost, That's a nice way of putting it, and I think that's really consistent with the tone of this record as well, that with the vocals being quite from a human source but being delivered in quite an unhuman way, it's unsettling. So I think that is definitely a thread. It's quite different by the time he gets to No Light, the third track. The way it disintegrates into that, it doesn't come charging in the way that Dead Format does. It's sort of Dead Format collapses into No Light slowly, and No Light sort of emerges from the wreckage as this very steady thing. It's got this really curb crawling, airy rhythm to it.
nighttime downtown LA sort of creepiness to it that's just, again, unrelenting but not fast. It just is steady but understated. This song and this album in general quite often remind me of films like Mandy or The Guest, where they're sort of deliberately referencing retro stuff, but they're delivering it in a much more postmodern, high-tech way. This track reminds me of that combination of old sensibilities but modern technology and delivery.
Yeah, I definitely thought Mandy this week as well, listening to that.
Yeah. Also, this song is so patient, and then it explodes into that beautiful euphoric ending. I think that climax of the song is just a joy.
Yeah, I've written the same thing. It's a really patient song. It brings in layers and layers until you get like a transition around 3:30 where the beat changes, and then you've got like another melody buried underneath the beat, just in the right hand channel. It's a hypnotic song. One of the things I like about this record, and I like about Ben's work in general, is that he loves a groove. The beats and the bass lines always form a really solid groove that you can pop no matter what's happening, no matter what chaos or beauty's going on all around about you. Maybe with the exception of Inferno, and even then in some places, like there's always like a root that grounds you, in the song where you can actually move your body to it. The third movement around like 5:50 in this song is really cool. When the beat shifts again and there's like a lot of weird noises around about the edge of the mix, it kind of feels as though you're driving through a Tron or something like that. Like it's like you're in an 80s video game. The end is pure triumph. Yeah, it really is.
Atrophies as well, when that starts. Atrophies is actually probably like one of my favourite ones on this album. It's like the level in a Sonic the Hedgehog or something where it's like a weird slow kind of level or something, but I think what you were saying, Mark, about the groove is right through that song as well. I love that whole vibe of Atrophies.
It's a lighter touch that I think sometimes doesn't appear on the more unrelenting later stuff, I was trying to mess about with different analogies, and I settled on the analogies of drinks and strong drinks, liquor, which I think Ben would approve of.
You love your food analogies.
I do. Well, I'm going for drinks here because it's Ben,
Right.
But I think if you look at some of the Blanck Mass records, you compare some of the tunes to really strong, intense, short drinks and spirits. Like Rhesus Negative could be like an absinthe. Something like Please would maybe be like a martini or something like that, a bit smoother. You've got things like the Bloody Mary of Death Drop, really caustic and again spicy and bitter. I think something that's interesting about Dumb Flesh is it sometimes feels like a drink that's been dashed with lemonade. It's got like a bubbliness, it's got a sweetness, and a lightness just subtly mixed through it that I think also is part of why it maybe feels easier to go back to when the weather and the nights are like this, when they're lighter, it's summerier, it's just that little bit more refreshing, it's got a little bit more space in it, it's a little bit softer on the palate, and songs like this in particular I think really play a big part in that. I would also say that even just down to the things like the percussion, the claps on this sound like little bubbles popping. The percussion, the electronic percussion, and the little like arpeggiated noises and things like that, they sound like little gas bubbles. They bubble away in this song, and I think there's something quite playful about that. It's whimsical. I think the lightness of this is part of why this is such a good choice of an album, because it does make it a little easier for the listener that isn't the pure hardcore listener who's ready for anything and ready for as loud as you want to take it. It makes it a little bit easier to engage with it in less intense circumstances.
Yeah, it's really warm. It's got a lot of really warm, rich synth sounds on it, and that kind of reminds me a little bit of Nine Inch Nails in places. Like he occasionally will do a similar sort of thing, mostly in his like soundtrack instrumentally stuff, as he'll go for like this kind of more warm, organic sort of feel. And again, he keeps having those snatches of vocals, making melodies out of vowel sounds from other songs, which I think gives it an extra layer of catchiness, another hook to grab onto.
But there is a really dark line going through this song as well. And it's called Atrophies. So do you know what I mean? There is a dark line of putrefaction going on.
It's not for Lanes.
Is that an AFI song? A dark line of putrefaction?
I think it's Cannibal Corpse, isn't it? By the way, whom Blanck Mass actually supported in Texas? Cannibal Corpse.
That's mental.
I know.
That would have been a nexus, wouldn't it?
Could have been.
Could have been.
Well, interestingly though, he follows that with Cruel Sport. Now, I think Cruel Sport has to be one of the most overlooked tunes in his catalogue. I think it might be because of where it is in this album. It's kind of at the business end of this album. You get quite emotionally invested in it, and this arrives at 5, and that can sometimes be a bit of a no man's land on an album. You know, you see it with some of the best albums of all time around about this kind of period in it. You know, even like albums like Nevermind have a sort of, not a nothing song, but you have a Drain You. It's a bit of a grower, you know, and I think this is really that sort of tune for him. It has a lot of the dynamics that really distinguish his later stuff, albeit it has a very slightly lighter production because of the album it's on. I think the chord motif that manifests around about 3 minutes in that with the huge horns sound is totally apocalyptic. It's fucking brilliant. And that pitched, snaking vocal,
a vocoder almost.
Yeah, it's so odd. It's very manipulated, but there's almost no other vocal would have really complemented this song. I think you must have, whether or not he experimented with loads of different approaches, that is the perfect answer to a question that this song was asking. Because it doesn't intrude on the instrumentation, but it definitely adds to the overall thing. Again, I think it's a really underappreciated track. Not that it's not appreciated, but yeah, it wasn't a single. It's not the go-to tune, but I don't know how many times I've even seen it live. But I think it's a really, really strong song.
I love Cruel Sport. I think it's great. Like, I love how dense it is. It's just like layer upon layer of information. I've written so much on this, so I won't go into all of it because we could be here for fucking ages, but it's actually really groovy, especially when the vocal samples, the chopped up ones you're talking about, Chris, towards the end. It actually becomes like really deeply groovy, and then when it gets really intense towards the end, there's like this big Vangelis style like synth sound at 650, which is just pure brilliant. I think it's a really great song, and the way that he keeps the thing that kind of frustrates me about the song, but that I like about it, is he keeps bringing in little melodies, and then they just go away. They just like decay. That's done. That's it. You've had that one little snatch of that, and then I guess we'll just put something else in later on. You know, so rewarding, that song. So rewarding.
Consistent with that mixtape thing that he described, Double Cross is probably the most overtly retro on the collection, and maybe one of his most overtly retro releases, full stop. It has this real video game meets action movie feel to it. It has a dead strong mid-range hook that defines it early on, but then that sort of plays like a relay race with a second slightly higher hook, and then he adds a third hook that comes in intermittently that's even higher again. It's a really interesting structure, I think. There's also throughout that song a whole bunch of like really panning noisy filters that swirl around you, and if you're listening on headphones, it's like passing spacecraft. You know what I mean? It's like it goes by your right and then by your left, and there's a really interesting 3D architecture to this bit of music, albeit I think it is quite a light-hearted bit, you know, quite a childish he's engaging with the things, these pleasures, the young pleasures of video games and action movies and stuff like that, in a much more kind of basic way than he maybe does on the likes of Animated Violence Mild. Lung, 7th track, penultimate track. That song just starts straight in a way that I don't think he would do now. That's a little bit of a relic in terms of production style. I mean, it works, but it's just not something I really recognise in his work since. I think this is one of his lightest moments, obviously. It still has a little air of menace, that kind of like putrefaction thing that you spoke about. It's called Lung. There's obviously that physiology thing to it, but it just never really screams in your face, and it almost sort of sits glowering at you. It never really rises from its chair, even in the corner of the room. There's something quite subtle about it.
Body horror.
Yeah, maybe a subtle body horror, kind of reflecting the cover as well, that fleshy, amorphous thing that's in the sleeve. Has a really subtle percussive kind of Morse code sequence that goes through it, which is a really nice touch, very delicate. And yeah, it's an approach that I don't think you really see in a lot of the rest of his stuff, other than maybe the white math polymorph thing. It's quite sparse and it has a similar palette to that.
Yeah, it's quite drony, isn't it? For me, I've written the synths feel really kind of far off. They kind of dance around, but they're just like earlier songs are just out of view almost, or just on the periphery, I suppose. Yeah. I like how restrained this song is. It's really brooding almost, like you said. It's like cloud in the corner, and then this record just finishes so big.
Amazing.
For me.
Yeah.
I actually think, as good as it's been up to this point, the final song, Detritus, makes every single song that came before it even more special, because it sort of like bookends it in a way. Like if you look at Loam and you look at this, it bookends it with so much class. I mean, obviously it starts with that raging sort of machine noise and static, which is quite reminiscent of like some of the 80s industrial experimental stuff of people like SPK. Like their first couple of records were, literally machine noises, really, really harsh, but it then blossoms out. I mean, blossoms maybe the wrong expression, because it is much more an eruption, isn't it? The way it just, there's that subtle hint. You hear like just about 10 seconds before it happens, you hear the little beginnings of the melodic sort of structure poking through, and then it just bursts. And I think it's an incredibly romantic song, and I think it actually kind of tries to mask its own romanticism by being really harsh and by being really saturated, by being really loud, but it's not able to hide the pure romanticism that kind of underscores it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in the last week, this is the song that I think I've overlooked in the past, and I've came to really, really love it. I think saying that it has a romantic element is totally true. It has a kind of emotional wave, do you know what I mean? A big sigh.
It does say a sigh, yeah, very much so. The chord progression is just otherworldly in this song. I love it, and it's what I was talking about earlier when I spoke about the first album, and the final track on that first album. It set the scene for that really dynamic chord structure that has become, I think, a real signature for Blanck Mass. And there's a second lift actually that comes into this tune. He's exploded into that sound, but he then compounds it with a second lift around about 5 minutes 14, I think it is.
I've got 5 minutes 13, that extra layer of synth, yeah.
Yeah, that extra layer is just like, it's a bit like what he did with Red Wing and the Fuck Button stuff, where you don't think the song can get any heavier, and then he finds crannies to slip in another layer of sound just to make it even thicker and more overwhelming, and I just absolutely love that approach. There's a really, really subtle, but if you notice it, a very, very pretty sort of female sounding vocal
buried underneath.
Buried underneath around it. You can hear it at 5 minutes 30 if you're curious, and when you hear it, it's fucking gorgeous, and it's amazing that it's not pushed out more. It's very confident to not feel like you have to really put that on a pedestal. But as I said, I think this tune makes everything better before it, and I love also the way it fragments and disintegrates, the delicate crumbling, the electronic crumbling, like falling into pixels almost at the end there. I think that's just such a beautiful ending to it. To put my brackets on it, his later work is denser and fuller, but I love that sort of the uncertainty, the tentativeness. There's a tentativeness that goes through this record that I think gives it something really special, and it's got room to breathe because it's not quite as full on. And whilst there may be, well, certainly there's tracks that are just as strong, if not stronger, on the later records, there is a returnability to this album, and actually this album I think is more adaptable to different situations than his later work, because his later work is so full on. There are certain times you just don't want to hear it. You're sitting out in the sunshine with a cold beer. It's not necessarily the best music to put on in that environment, whereas this actually really works, and I think it's slightly more adaptable. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Definite yes for me.
I think that for this album, like what you're touching on there about its adaptability, I think for me, it's maybe more of a crowd pleaser in some ways, in that the later stuff, or especially, the albums that came after this immediately, he's gone down quite a different road from this. And I think even though this as an album is varied, it's more... I don't know, is it more commercially viable? Probably. I don't know, maybe just like has a more commercial sound to it than the other ones. Like, I know the other ones are more commercial in a kitsch way. He's what's the word, he's co-opting something about commerce in the later albums, whereas this I think is more ravey or dancey or whatever, in a way that would maybe be more of a crowd pleaser. But
it's maybe got a touch more naivety to it as well.
Aye, maybe. But for me, I just connect to it so much. I go back to it a lot. And I think if I'm going to be listening to World Eater or something like that, then I do have to be in the mood for taking that beating. But this is more, it's more gentle, but not all the way through, obviously. But and I think it's maybe it's understated in some way. I think it deserves to go in.
Yeah, I think it's a good choice. I back it for sure.
Bullseye, Vicky, well done.
Thank you.
Smashed it.
Thanks.
Now we get to try and tiptoe around the fact that we've got to connect Ben to Varg Vikernes, which is probably a bit easier than Ben would be comfortable admitting. But we'll try and do it in a way that doesn't see him outed in Salon magazine.
This is the first time we're seeing Nexus tonight. Will it be the last? What do they have in store for us? Not good for
Why am I here? You're in the Nexus. This is the Nexus. For you, this is what you want.
I wish it was Cliff Richard.
I cannot imagine how we could connect him to Cliff Richard. That's a challenge for another day. Alright, okay. Vicky, it's your choice, so you're up first, mate.
Okay. Right, hold on.
Hang on. Just to give credit where it's due, Varg was chosen by Declan McCafferty, the second most Irish listener to the podcast.
Right, okay. I think I found this more challenging than you, just because I think of my total lack of familiarity with Burzum.
No, but it's also because I live in a world that's fucking draped. my life is draped with Nazis. That's why.
Well, yeah, I don't know what to say, but so Interestingly, I found on the Fred Perry website, you know,
But the clothing brand?
Yes, Fred Perry.
Is Ben sponsored by Fred Perry?
Well, I don't know.
It's Varg.
You might want to ask Ben about this, right? But like, Fred Perry have got a part of their website called Subculture. Right?
Okay.
Oh my God. What is this?
And they've done a profile on Ben Power from Blanck Mass, where they've asked him lots of questions about what subcultures have influenced him, what bands he's into, and all the rest of it. And in that profile, he actually says that Bad Year by Iron Monkey is probably his favourite metal song of all time. Iron Monkey are kind of like is it a sludge metal band from
Yeah, we've
England.
done them for the show. We did them for the show.
Aye, so they've been compared to a greater or lesser extent to I Hate God. In fact, I think people said that they were a bit of an I Hate God copycat band, which I don't think they liked very much.
They're better than I Hate God, definitely.
Now, I Hate God actually turned up on a soundtrack for a Harmony Korine film called Gummo. Their songs
It's a really good film.
Serving Time in the Middle of Nowhere was on the Gummo soundtrack alongside a Burzum track, and I can't say what that track is because I don't know how to pronounce it, but
You've got to try. No, but I mean, you've got to try. Come on, try. Make it as
oh
bad as you
God,
can.
right,
I know you're a language snob, but try it.
I didn't even read, like, here it's here. Rundgang av den transcendental Egenhetsstøtte. There, that was my best.
Sure, that's perfect.
Classic.
That classic. Catchy.
Some classic Scandinavian racism there. Perfectly enunciated.
There you go.
Mark?
Right, okay. So Ben, as we've discussed, used to be in Fuck Buttons. Fuck Buttons remixed, in their time, remixed quite a few songs, including one from Moby called The Perfect Life, and one from Jonesy, the singer of Sigur Rós, called Tornado. And both Moby and Sigur Rós have had videos directed by Jonas Åkerlund. He, for Moby, directed James Bond theme in Porcelain, and for Sigur Rós, he directed a video for a song called Uvia. In 2018, Åkerlund directed an adaptation of Michael Monaghan and Didrik Sonderland's book, Lords of Chaos, which is basically an account of the early black metal scene in Norway. If you have got no idea what I'm talking about, please go and listen to our black metal episode, because we cover that in some great detail.
Yeah, don't buy Lords of Chaos. Go and listen to our black metal episode. Don't give money to Michael Monaghan.
Yes, he's a Nazi.
He's just a knob.
In that film, Emery Cohen plays Vars Vikernes, which I'm sure was a delight for Varg, because his racist ass must have been raging that a Jewish actor was playing him in a film adaptation of his murder of a member of his band. So
yeah, absolutely, he was delighted about it. He actually just took it as a slap in the face, and it made him hate the film all the more, so he felt quite sort of vindicated by it. Yeah, he posted many times on his channel about it before he got banned. I think he's banned for YouTube. I'm pretty sure he must be banned for YouTube now.
He must be, yeah.
The pish he comes out of. Alright, cool. Well, Ben, aka Blanck Mass, has recently been announced for having scored the upcoming film Ted K, which is a story of Ted Kaczynski, who was the Unabomber. When was it? 1995. The magazine Penthouse, the jazz mag Penthouse, published the Unabomber's manifesto. Now that was like contemporary. The Unabomber had sent this manifesto out, and places had passed on it, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the FBI, the head of the FBI, and I think the Attorney General or somebody at the time had said, please publish this. You know, somebody might see something in it that leads us to the guy. And so Penthouse did it. And then I think sometime after it, Kaczynski said something like he was going to plant, because he wasn't happy that a scuzzy mag like Penthouse had published it. He was like, I'm going to plant one more bomb just because that was Penthouse that did it. So the Washington Post published it then to try and prevent that. But yeah, there were also letters between the Unabomber and Penthouse. I think Vice has got a whole bunch of them that it published, like correspondence. But the owner of Penthouse magazine was a guy called Bob Guccione, and he'd apparently refused to work with the FBI on this, to cooperate with them to help track down. But I don't see how. Anyway, supposedly he refused to work with the FBI, despite the fact that he published it when they wanted him to. Regardless, in 1983, a guy called Mitchell L. Werbel, accepted a $1 million check to kill Bob Guccione, as well as a publisher called Walter Annenberg, Frank Sinatra, and Hugh Hefner. So these 4 guys were to die. Now, as it happens, Mitchell L. Werbel died a month after he got that check. And it also, as it happens, that check was cancelled before it could be cashed, and it was cancelled by Larry Flint's business manager, because Larry Flint was the guy that tried to pay $1 million to this man to have Frank Sinatra and so on killed. And I think somehow, because the check was never cashed, it somehow protected Flint from prosecution. He got out of another legal case around about a similar time because he was having like severe mental difficulties. I can't remember exactly. Anyway, Larry Flint was shot and paralysed by a guy called Joseph Paul Franklin. Joseph Paul Franklin was actually executed in November of 2013. He was also known as, somewhat unimaginatively, the racist killer. Try harder. The racist killer had 8 convictions, as well as 20 plus suspected that were never convicted. And he apparently shot Larry Flint due to Hustler magazine, Larry Flint's publication, publishing, inverted commas, race mixing porn. Now, Joseph Paul Franklin had a book dedicated to him. The book was called Hunter. It was released in 1989, and it was written by a guy called William Luther Pierce, who also went under the pen name Andrew MacDonald. And William Luther Pierce is the guy behind the infamous Turner Diaries, which we've mentioned a few times. The Turner Diaries was found on Timothy McVeigh's front seat after he bombed the Murrah building in Oklahoma. William Luther Pierce also founded the National Alliance, a kind of famous neo-Nazi group in America. In 1998, William Luther Pierce met a guy called Hendrik Mobus, who also goes under the name Randall Flagg. Mobus was on the run from a parole violation after he'd posed with Nazi banners inside Auschwitz with a bunch of his mates, including I think it was his brother, and he'd thrown a sea kyle publicly in Germany, so he'd violated parole on those grounds. The parole that he was violating was for the murder of a 15-year-old called Sandro Bayer by Mobus and 2 of the other members of the German National Socialist black metal band Absurd, who are quite notorious. Absurd also released an album called Thuringian Pagan Madness that has Sandro Bayer's grave on the front saying, "We killed this boy." The reason he got parole was because he was only 17 when he committed that murder, so that was kind of a loophole that he managed to sneak through. But Mobus also founded the German Heathen Front, which is the Deutsche Heidnische Front, and the German Heathen Front is an offshoot of the Norsk Heathen Front, or the Norsk Hedinsk Front, which was generally seen as being founded by Varg Vikernes.
A real litany of fucking scumbags, eh? A real litany of scumbags.
Nazis up the yin-yang.
Sorry, it took me ages to stop laughing at Guccione as a surname.
Well, Guccione actually gets called out by Axl Rose in a song on Use Your Illusion 2 because he got some shit about it in a magazine, and he's like, "Bob Guccione, I'm going to kick your ass." It's basically just him like shouting about journalists that have wronged him, and I believe he calls one of them a faggot, which is quite funny as well.
Axl Rose has got some colourful lyrics in the first Guns N' Roses album as well. I believe the N-word makes an appearance.
Yeah.
That was good. Thanks for that, Vicky.
Yeah.
Fucking quality choice, and I certainly had a fun week listening to Blanck Mass. Listeners, if you enjoyed it, please go back and listen to our extended interview with Ben, because it's over 3 parts and it was really, really good. And the third part is him recommending some albums which were excellent. Also, Iron Monkey making an appearance, The Caretaker. So next week, Vicky, you'll not be with us. Dave will probably be back, assuming he's not on a park bench.
He'll still be alive, I just won't be here.
Well,
I know, but we'll see how next week goes. Actually, don't.
see how your house renovation's going. But yeah, and I believe next week, Mark, we're going to pull the trigger on something that we've sort of been dancing around for a while, right? Because we've done a couple of episodes of the podcast that have referred to supergroups. We did Tomahawk, and then recently,
All Pigs Must Die.
All Pigs Must Die. And from both of those episodes, we had to excise a huge chunk where we got carried away and went on a big fucking tangent about supergroups. So we are going to do a supergroup mixtape, and I'm just going to prepare you for it. It's definitely going to be 2 parts, because the first part is going to be us going through a litany of supergroups, big and small. Then the second part will be the 3 of us nominating a supergroup choice. Vicky, any come to the mind?
Supergroups.
Aye.
Just obvious ones like the Travelling Wilburys.
Fucking, how old are you?
I was just thinking they're McBusted. Are they a supergroup?
They are a supergroup. They are definitely making an appearance. Yeah.
I don't
What's
know.
that? West? Was it West Zone or Boys Life?
Boys Life cripes. I'm sure you should like resurrect the Dave Grohl Nexus for that, because surely he's in must be in about 10 supergroups, right?
Well, even Foo Fighters is kind of a supergroup. Yeah.
And so is Queens of the Stone Age.
Yep.
Aye.
They're all going to be there. They're all going to be there, and Probot.
All your favourites.
Enough of that. All right. Well, thank you very much. That was total blast. And
thanks for inviting me back.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It was great. It was great.
Yeah,
great fun.
it was great to talk about that album.
Sure, we'll see you soon.
Yeah.
Before we go, I just need to do something I should have done at the start of the podcast and shout out 2 people that gave us money this week. One is Sarah J. Matson from America, who really fucking loved our Big Country episode and saw fit to give us some cash for it, which is great. And Mr. Todd Cool, who joined us on Patreon as well. Thank you very much for your donations, folks.
Yeah, I think for the American admirers of Big Country, we'll offer a very Scottish farewell. And Vicky, you've probably got the best accent for this, but see you later.
If I see it. I didn't hear what you said before that.
A very Scottish farewell. See you later.
Alright, see you later.